These next 3 points in my top 10 leadership bits of wisdom are 3 know the difference betweens. Knowing the difference between 2 things that sound similar and sound the same is a huge leadership skill and gift, because often without this clarity, you are talking about 2 things like they're the same thing, which finishes up taking us conversationally and conceptually to a completely false conclusion, because we haven't separated out that in the room we're talking about 2 different things. And one of my discoveries as a leader was that I had to realize that in the room people are using 2 terms, 2 ideas, 2 concepts interchangeably as if they're the same thing. And so these next 3 points are going to be asking you, do you know the difference between? And there could be an endless list of those. These next 3 are my top 3 things that I think we get confused about as leaders, that you need to know the difference between them to be a great leader. And the first one is, know the difference between your core competency and your authority. The difference between your competency, what you are brilliant at as a person, what is your particular gift in your leadership, and your authority. Because one of these 2 things is very narrow and one of them is very broad. Your competency is narrow. That is, what you are particularly good at as a leader is more narrow than your broad authority. So you may be the boss over us all, but that doesn't mean that you are as competent as we are in a certain area as your employees, your staff, your volunteers. And sometimes what happens with leadership, especially in a corporate setting, is that we get confused between my right to step into your department under my employment, my seniority that lets me come in and question you in your department, in your area of expertise and competency. Like I would go into my media team and have a conversation with them, or my financial team, have a conversation with them, or my event planning people, and I would be in their area of expertise. I brought them on the team because they're brilliant at something that I am not. And what would happen is that I would forget that I am now in a room with people who are better at something than I am. And just because I'm the leader, and I may be better at leadership and overall leadership, and I may have this overall view of everything, whereas theirs may just be compartmental and in their sphere of competency. People began to resent it when I barged in on the authority ticket, as it were, because I have a right to ask you about something because I'm your boss. But then I would be out of my depth and I would be out of my sphere of skill because I'm not competent in media or in finances or in event planning or in whatever it may have been. And I think you have to know the difference as a leader, and great leaders know this, the difference between your competency and your overall authority. And people don't like it. We don't like it when you come into our area of expertise pretending that you know better than us, or interfering in our decision making and our ideas and the way we do something, because you think your authority lets you do that, and it doesn't. When you as a leader, as a boss, as an employer, are in the room with other people who have an expertise and a competency you don't, you are not the leader anymore in that room. When they're speaking, they're the leader and you're the follower. They're the expert and you're the one that's learning. You're the novice. You're the inexperienced one. You're the one that lacks information, wisdom, education. So learn when you are doing life with your team, learn to be quiet, learn to go in the seat of the pupil, not the teacher. They become the teacher when you are in their area of brilliance and you are not in your area of brilliance. Because that confusion happens when we don't know the difference between the two. would you be thoughtful, and people will love you for this, by the way. Your team, your staff will love it when you sit in a room. We all know you're the boss. You don't need to keep telling us that you're in charge. In fact, the best leaders are that because they don't try to be leaders. So if you're trying to be a leader by talking over me or by coming across like you know more than I do about the thing you employed me to help you with, then I lose respect for you. We lose respect for leaders that behave that way. So know the difference between those two. Then the next time you're sitting in a room or on a phone or talking to someone, let them know, hey, I don't know here. Here's where I'm relying on you to guide me, to give me wisdom, to give me information, to bring me up to speed, to give me your best counsel on this. You are now in the seat of a person that needs that competency, so that when you have an authoritative leader decision to make, you have collected all the different bits of genius that you surrounded yourself with. You get to say a thing exceptionally well because you're submitted to people's competencies, not because you're winging it, ignoring their competency, as often happens in our world. Our politicians often come across winging it with things that they didn't listen to their inner cabinet advice voices about, or somebody in business. I'm so tempted to go off into Donald Trump world here of how he wings it and shoots from the hip, and then all his team run around trying to tidy up what he just said on Twitter, that gives them a massive PR, a massive political issue, a massive global relationship issue, because he just said what came to his head, because he's used to being this corporate in-charge entrepreneur rather than a consultative listening to all these experts around you that inform the way you come across, which makes you come across much more thought through and as a better leader than you are if you ignore their competency and just wing it because you're the boss and want to appear to be like you know it all. Know the difference between your core competency and your authority. One's narrow and one's broad. We're going to love you for figuring out the difference between those two. Secondly, know the difference between values and culture. My number 5 top tip as a leader, to develop as a leader, to get better as a leader, is know the difference between values and culture. Now, a lot of the mentoring I have done this last few years, this has been a major issue for leaders from all walks of life. That they use the language interchangeably about vision and values and culture and resources and products interchangeably, as if it's all the same thing. When they often ask me to look at their publications or their websites, that's the first thing I noticed, that all of it's mixed up, that they don't understand that values and culture are fundamentally different, and vision is different, and the product is different. So it's worth me saying this to you as one of my top tips, that great leaders understand values are beliefs, culture is behavior. Values are what you believe. So supposing you believe in excellence, that's a great value to have. Most organizations, I suppose, if you studied them, looked at their online publications of their branding, would commit to excellence. But then if the behavior of your staff, if our experience as we interact with your product, with your business, with your organization, is that you don't call us back and you don't respond to our requests and you ignore deadlines and you don't produce what you said you would and you don't give us what we were led to expect and we don't have a good experience, then we would not say that you were an excellent company. We would say that you had a value of excellence, but your behavior was shoddy and average and it'll do. So that's what I'm talking about. In fact, what this means is that your culture actually is way more important than what you say your values are. It's easy to select values. It's not easy to make those values the behavior in your organization. This is true in families. In a family, you could say, in our family, We have a value of being responsible with the furniture in the house or the behavior in the house. We have a value of everybody mucks in, everybody picks up a cup, everybody can wash up, everybody can vac a floor, everybody can iron, everybody can take care of the furniture, whatever. But then if I come to your house and it's like World War III and your kids are feral and it's a very unpleasant experience, it doesn't matter what you taught me when you did the parenting seminar. I came to your house and your values were, we do this in our house, but I then came to your house, so it's not your value. So I can tell what your values are from just experiencing your culture. If I deal with you as a business, if I trade with you as a customer, if I'm involved at all in your world, I know what your values are from your culture, because your culture is your value. By design or by default, your behavior is always going to be the tell on your values. So you might as well figure out up front, if I decide transparency is my value, then I've got to make sure in the company, in the organization, people don't find out something really important in a memo that they should have been involved in the explanation about and the journey about it before they just heard in a memo, this is what we're all going to do next, or so-and-so's got fired, isn't here anymore. Now, of course, culture changes as you grow. Values don't change. Values are fixed. They don't ever change. They don't need to change. Culture needs to be a moving landscape, because the way that you express transparency with 5 people in your team and staff is different to how you would manage transparency with 50 or 500 people in your staff. Now you're moving much more to who needs to know this. Everybody can know it when you're 5. Everybody doesn't need to know it when you're 50. And a lot of organizations try to keep the same circle of inclusion when you're large as you did when you're small. It's exhausting and unnecessary. So the expression of the culture, the way you behave in line with your value, has to be open to change, and it evolves. But your values don't change. I fly around the world a lot, and one of my pet hates and rants would be about British Airways. British Airways, if you Google them, they say that their culture, their values, is to fly and to serve. Well, in my opinion, British Airways do one of those. They fly, but they don't serve. British Airways do not have a serving culture. If you don't know that, book something with BA, then call someone with a problem you have. You'll find out they're not there to serve, they're there to fly. And they'll quote policy at you and systems at you, even though it's the daftest conversation you will ever have in your life with a human being. It's like talking with a robot, because they are not listening to you, because your problem maybe is a little bit unusual. And so that's where service really comes into its own. When as a customer you have a problem, that's where service begins to become the behavior. You think, wow, I will go back there. This is why people keep following you, listening to you, trading with you, buying your stuff. It's not because of your values, it's because of your behavior. They have a great experience while they're dealing with you. That's why they always come to your restaurant. That's why they buy your particular product as opposed to someone else that has the same product as you do. But they love your brand because your culture is what they're buying into, not your values. So, know the difference between your values and your culture and make sure they're both the same. If they're not, you have a disconnect and you don't know the difference between your values and your culture. What is this conversation? Is it a values one or a cultural one? And cultural engineering, cultural architecture is a very rare skill that's in massive demand in the world, because most leaders are good at values, but they're not good at making that a behavioral culture, especially in a volunteer context where people don't think that they have to behave in a certain way because you're not paying them to behave in a certain way. And of course, doing what I did for 30 years in the church world, believe me, I figured out that the hard way. Getting people to toe the line, to be carriers and producers of that value in the culture was a nightmare. But I was not willing to be negotiable on that. Neither should you. Know the difference between values and culture is a huge gift to your team to figure that out. And number 6, know the difference between strategy and tactics. Again, often in a conversation, we talk about them interchangeably, and they're not. It's been said that the Second World War was really a tale of two leaders, Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler. And the difference in the outcome of the war was in the way that each of those two was wired. One of them, Churchill, was a strategist, and historians say that Hitler was a tactician who believed he was a strategist, who behaved like he was a strategist. And the difference is huge, because strategists are big people kind of leaders. And the best leaders, I think, are big picture, big idea, across the board grasp of what's going on leaders. The best leaders in the world are strategists, not tacticians. Now, leaders can still be tacticians, but they shouldn't be the overall vision setting, pace setting leaders. And Churchill knew that he was not wired for tactics. Tactics are the details of the implementation of the strategy. So Churchill would come up with a strategy, then he'd let the generals in the army, the generals became the tacticians that took that strategy to fight the war in the strategic way. He would then step back and get out of the way of the generals tactically putting that strategy into the war theater, into the countries where they were doing war. The tacticians would get involved in making that fit as best it could with what they were dealing with. That often the strategists weren't aware of what the localized problems were. Sometimes you as a leader don't know how this thing gets implemented. You just know this is the strategy, this is the big idea. What Hitler did was he micromanaged. He would not only have an idea, he would then breathe down and backseat drive his generals, which cost them the war, because one of his massive mistakes was, we're going to invade Russia in winter. And though his generals said to him, this is suicide, we should not attempt approaching Russia in winter. The Russians were built for fighting in winter, the Germans were not. And it cost them that season and stage of the war, because it was a disaster. The Russian campaign was a disaster, because Churchill could have had the idea that we need to at some point our resources towards Russia. That's a strategy. But the tactics of that, the where, who, how, where, and when, comes down to the tacticians. And that's really all Hitler was. But he thought he was a strategist with the big picture. But he wasn't. He was really a meddler, a micromanager. And I want you to know the difference in your own skill set. Are you a strategist or a tactician? Because if you serve and work for or are led by a strategist that does not meddle in tactics, it's a win-win. People love that. And in the war, it became known as hard targets and loose control. Having a hard target, Russia, a hard target, whatever we're focusing on now as the war front. It's a hard target, but a loose control. People love it when leaders have, here's the target, cool, we're going to do this, this is what we want to do, this is the way we're going to point, this direction, here's our values. But then don't have strong controls in how that gets done. Leave that to the tacticians. Leave that to the competency, skill set, as I said earlier, of the people that make that happen. Know the difference between strategy and tactics. Know which one you are, know which one you're working with, and don't try to be both. It drives people crazy. Know the difference in you and in the people you're working with.